When the patrol car turned onto White Oak Drive, nothing indicated that behind the door of the neat suburban house number 117, a nightmare was already unfolding. The dispatcher briefly transmitted over the radio, "Child unconscious, circumstances unclear." Officer Mark Wallace, who entered the house first, froze at the threshold, unable to immediately comprehend what he saw. A boy about 6 years old lay in the middle of the living room, his face deathly pale, lips blue. Two medics were rushing around him, repeating short commands to each other. "Pulse is dropping," one of them sharply said. A little further away, as if having fallen out of reality, sat an 8-year-old girl, quietly and indifferently watching as they tried to bring her brother back to life. On the couch, not far from the boy, a woman in home clothes was hysterically repeating, "He was just playing. I don't understand. I was upstairs." Her voice was trembling, and it was obvious that she was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. A man, probably the father, stood in the corner, staring at the floor and confusedly fingering his phone, as if trying to remember a number he needed to dial, although help had already arrived. Mark Wallace took several steps forward, carefully stepping around the medications scattered on the floor, and noticed small details that sharply contrasted with what was happening. Toys scattered around the living room, a child's cup with juice on, the coffee table, a television turned on without sound, broadcasting bright and cheerful cartoons. The only motionless object in all this chaos remained the girl, sitting neatly on a chair by the wall. Lily Greer, in white tights and a blue dress, as if waiting for her turn at the doctors or teachers at a parent-teacher conference. Her hands were perfectly folded on her knees, hair neatly combed, and her gaze directed forward, empty and indifferent. She did not even turn her head when the officer approached, did not flinch when the medics loudly reported that her brother's condition was rapidly deteriorating. "Heartbeat is disappearing! Prepare the defibrillator!" one of the doctors shouted loudly. At this moment, Lily slightly tilted her head, as if trying to get a better look at her brother's face, then indifferently returned to her original position again. It seemed that for her, everything happening meant absolutely nothing. A few hours later, Officer Wallace filled out the preliminary report where he dryly stated, "At address 117 White Oak Drive, Daniel Greer, 6 years old, was found in critical condition. Present on the scene were parents, James and Emily Greer, as well as sister Lily Greer, 8 years old. There were no emotions in the documents, only cold recording of facts. But everyone who saw Lily's face that evening already began to understand that in this story, everything was much more terrible than it might seem at first glance. The strangest thing about this story was not even what happened that October evening on White Oak Drive, but how drastically everything changed in just 4 short months. Just 4 months ago, the Greer family photograph, the very one that hung on the living room wall, seemed like the perfect advertisement for a happy life. There were smiles, hugs, a new house with a large backyard, and a caption on social media, "Starting our new life with an addition to the family." It seemed that nothing could foreshadow that in a few months, on this very carpet where Danny and Lily played board games, medics would be standing, trying to tear the boy from death's tenacious embrace. How is such a thing even possible? What could have led the perfect picture of family happiness to police sirens and a frozen, frighteningly calm girl in the corner? If we go back and look at the official documents, the story looked so standard and prosperous that it was impossible not to believe in it. Here is the adoption certificate from the 7th of June. Lily Greer, 8 years old. Adoptive parents, James and Emily Greer. Just one piece of paper, which meant an absolutely new world for Lily and for the Greers, the long-awaited fulfillment of a dream. In documents from the orphanage, Lily was described as a quiet, shy, and obedient girl who was loved by the caregivers and who was very much waiting for a new family. And here is the purchase agreement for that very house where the tragedy would later occur, the 4th of July address, 117 White Oak Drive. It was symbolic that this day coincided with Independence Day, and then the GirIs, of course, joked about this, posting photos against the backdrop of the new house with an American flag and the caption, "Our personal Independence Day from old. Problems. Welcome home, Lily." James in a baseball cap and Emily in a bright yellow dress held smiling Danny in their arms, and nearby stood Lily modestly, smiling slightly at the camera, as if not yet fully believing that she now had a real home. Friends and relatives actively commented on these photographs. "What a wonderful family. You are such good people. You have big hearts. Now everything will be great." And indeed, outwardly everything seemed exactly like that. Photos and videos appeared on Emily's page of how Lily rides a bicycle through the new neighborhood for the first time, how she and Danny feed ducks in the park, and even shots of a cozy family dinner with pizza, where everyone laughs and fools around in front of the camera. But then, after everything, among dozens of harmless comments, investigators would notice one seemingly meaningless message from Emily's friend. "Lily looks so serious. I hope she adapts quickly." Then no one paid attention to this, because adapting to a new family, new house, and new life is indeed not easy. Especially if you spent your whole life in an orphanage before that. The chronology was simple and clear. The adoption took place 4 months ago at the beginning of June. A month later, the family moved to a new house. 3 months of perfect life filled with ordinary joys that looked like a picture from a family album on social media. 3 months during which neighbors saw happy parents and children playing in the backyard. 3 months in which there was no reason to think that behind the door of cozy house number 117, a tragedy was already beginning to ripen. And now this perfect picture had become a grim puzzle. What was really happening behind the closed doors of the GirIs all these months? Why is the family that so joyfully accepted the girl from the orphanage now standing on the threshold of losing their younger son? The answers to these questions would come later, along with the first results of the investigation, which would begin with the most innocent, with conversations with neighbors. And it would be their testimony that would first lift the veil over what the new life of the GirI family was really like. At first, it seemed that what happened to Danny was a tragic but absolutely accidental event. Small children constantly get into trouble, and even the most responsible parents cannot protect them from everything. But when investigators began to dig deeper, it became clear that this incident might have been only the tip of the iceberg. And what if in reality alarming signals had been appearing for a long time? Just no one noticed them. Here is a report about the disappearance of the GirI family's pet, filed by James at the local police department on the 12th of August, almost 2 months before that October evening. A cat named Marcel disappeared at night, simply did not return from the backyard where he usually loved to walk. Neighbors shrugged their shoulders. No one saw anything. James and Emily then walked around the entire neighborhood, hung up announcements posted on social media. "Help find Marcel. The children are very worried." But the cat never appeared. Such an event in the suburbs happens often by itself. Animals disappear regularly. But there was one strangeness that the neighbor mentioned when police questioned residents after the incident with Danny. She remembered how the morning after Marcel's disappearance, she noticed Lily by the porch of their house. The girl stood absolutely calmly and looked into the bushes. I asked her if she was looking for the kitty, and Lily smiled so strangely and said, "No, he won't come back," the neighbor later recounted. Then the woman attributed this to childish directness, although now this episode looked much more ominous. The next alarming bell sounded exactly a month later, on the 15th of September. Emily urgently took Danny to the local clinic with suspected serious head injury. The doctor examined the boy and made a diagnosis. Soft tissue bruise of the head, received as a result of falling from stairs. In Danny's medical record, this entry looked dry and mundane, as if such things happen to every second child. But in the case materials, there was another curious detail. During the conversation with the doctor, Emily mentioned that she herself did not see the moment of the fall. I heard the sound of impact and immediately ran to the stairs. Lily was already standing next to Danny and calmly said that he had stumbled. Emily described the situation. Then the doctor just shrugged and reassured the mother. Indeed, children fall, nothing terrible. But now, after the October tragedy, even this insignificant detail took on a completely different tone. And the most frightening thing here is not even the incidents themselves, but how unnoticeably and consistently everything happened. First, the pet disappears, and Lily is nearby. Then Danny falls from the stairs, and again his sister is nearby, absolutely calm, as if everything happening does not concern her. When police began to carefully examine the parents' testimonies, one fact became too obvious to remain a coincidence. In both incidents, both with the cat's disappearance and with Danny's fall, only Lily was always nearby. Emily and James, of course, did not want to believe that their daughter could have had any relation to these strange events. They believed that she was just unlucky to be nearby at an unfortunate moment. But two such coincidences in a short period of time made investigators think, were these coincidences at all? It was precisely at this moment that the picture of what happened began to change dramatically. Instead of an accidental misfortune, a frightening pattern emerged. And now no one could close their eyes to the fact that Lily always turned out to be the only and completely calm witness to misfortunes in their house. Thus, the investigation gradually began to move toward the most terrible and incredible version. That an 8-year-old girl could have become the cause of what happened to her brother on that October evening. When investigators realized that too many coincidences could not be random, forensic experts returned to the house on White Oak Drive again. They knew that the chaos that reigned in the living room on the evening of the tragedy could hide something important behind it. They began to conduct a thorough examination of the house, step by step, room by room. The police understood. If what happened was not an accident, then somewhere there must remain a trace that would help understand the events of that night. The first few hours of searching yielded no results. In the living room, everything looked as expected. Toys on the floor, scattered sofa cushions, footprints of medics. However, the investigators' attention was drawn to the kitchen. This was the very room where parents usually run first when an accident happens to one of the children, Emily confirmed later. In panic, she immediately rushed there for a phone and a glass of water, trying to bring her son to consciousness, even before the ambulance arrived. At first glance, the kitchen was no different from any other in an ordinary American home. A dining table on which stood a plate with Danny's unfinished dinner, a glass with unfinished juice, an open package of cookies. But what interested investigators much more strongly were several open drawers. Emily said that in panic she was looking for bandages and painkillers, not even understanding what specifically was happening to her son. This sounded quite convincing, but something still did not add up. Continuing the examination, forensic experts moved to the bathroom on the second floor. It was there that the first material clue appeared, which definitively changed the view of the situation. A dry but extremely important remark appeared in the crime scene examination protocol. An empty package from the drug Cedarex was found on the bathroom floor. This was a medication that is usually prescribed to adults in cases of serious sleep disorders, strong sedative effect, strict dosage control, prohibition on use for children under 14 years old. All this made the find very alarming. The drug itself, of course, could be in the house legally. Many adults suffer from insomnia, and James Greer later confirmed in conversation with police that he indeed periodically took it to improve sleep. The problem was different. The package was found not in the medicine cabinet and not even in the parents' bedroom, but on the bathroom floor, practically hidden behind the laundry basket. Why was it exactly there, and most importantly, why was it completely empty? Danny's blood analysis gave the definitive answer to this question. traces of Cedarex were found in his body, and the concentration was so high that the boy immediately required emergency help. Accidentally eating such a dose of tablets is practically impossible, especially for a 6-year-old child, for whom reaching the medicine cabinet on the top shelf would be difficult even with a stool. This detail was not just important, it became a turning point. Investigators immediately began asking new questions to the parents. Emily and James categorically denied that they gave the drug to Danny, especially in such huge quantities. They were in complete confusion, not understanding how this could have happened. But investigators were more interested in something else. Who else could have access to the drug, and why did the empty package end up exactly in the bathroom where both children usually went? It was then that the figure of Lily surfaced again. That same quiet and calm girl who even on this evening remained the only person in the house not showing fear or panic. Investigators understood that 6-year-old Danny could not independently find the drug and take it in such a huge dose. But for an 8-year-old girl, this was quite possible. She could easily reach the shelf, open the package, and secretly mix tablets into her brother's juice or food. Now the investigation had to understand the main thing. Was this an intentional action? Or did Lily not fully understand the consequences of her actions? The next steps in the investigation would be devoted exactly to her. The quiet, calm girl with a mysterious and alarming look, which was already beginning to seem to investigators not just strange, but truly frightening. Now investigators understood that only one step separated them from solving what happened: to find out exactly how Cedarex tablets got into Danny's hands. From the very beginning, the parents claimed that this was impossible. But when police began to compare the testimonies of family members, strange things were immediately discovered. At the first interrogation, James Greer, the head of the family, looked simultaneously confused and irritated. "Listen, all medications in the house were always locked. We perfectly understood that with children such things are no joke," he confidently declared. When the investigator asked where exactly the drugs were stored, James clearly answered, "In a locked drawer in our bedroom. There is no other place, and never was." Then police spoke separately with Emily Greer, the children's mother. Her story was even more specific and stricter. "The key to this drawer is always with me. I carry it on a key ring together with house and car keys. No one except me could get access to the medications." Emily looked convincing, and her words seemed quite logical. But now the investigation had a new question. If the drugs were reliably hidden, how to explain the found empty package on the bathroom floor? When the turn came to Lily, a psychologist was in the room with her. The girl sat calmly, neatly folding her hands on the table, and did not look frightened or worried. At some point, the investigator carefully asked her, "Lily, have you ever seen tablets that Daddy takes?" The girl calmly shook her head. "No, I don't know where the tablets are." Then followed an important question. "And do you remember how your brother played or held in his hands something similar to a box or package from tablets?" And here, for the first time, sounded an answer that became pivotal. Lily slightly tilted her head, thought for a couple of seconds, and calmly said, "Yes, I saw. Danny was playing with some kind of box in the bathroom. I didn't touch it, just saw it." When she was asked to describe this box in more detail, Lily gave a clear description of the Cedarex package, although before this, she claimed that she did not know where medications were stored. This contradiction immediately attracted the investigation's attention. It turned out that the girl either did not realize what exactly she had told, or simply got confused in her own testimony. But even more important was that Lily's words clearly contradicted the parents' statements about the complete inaccessibility of drugs for children. Now police had to solve a difficult task: understand which of the three was lying. If the father and mother were sure that access to drugs was impossible, and the key was exclusively with Emily, then how did the tablets end up in Danny's hands in the bathroom? and even in front of Lily's eyes. These questions could not remain unanswered. And it was exactly after this series of interrogations that Lily's status in the case materials changed. Now she stopped being just a random witness. It was officially recorded. Lily Greer, 8 years old, appears in the case as a key witness. Her testimony has significant contradictions with parents' testimony regarding access to medications. This was the first serious step toward answering the main question that tormented everyone. Could a quiet and calm 8-year-old girl really have a connection to the tragedy that occurred in her family? It was from this moment that all attention of the investigation was focused on Lily. Her actions, words, and even facial expressions were now analyzed literally under a microscope because they could hide the key to solving this disturbing story. Investigators continued to carefully study the details of what happened and inevitably returned to past strange cases, which now looked completely different. The question was no longer just about coincidences, but about how exactly Lily behaved in those moments when the family faced unexpected and frightening situations. One of the episodes, which Lily's mother, Emily, described in detail, became especially revealing. Remembering the day of Danny's fall down the stairs, she told the investigator, "When I heard the noise and ran to the stairs, the first person I saw was Lily. She was standing at the top. She wasn't screaming, wasn't crying, wasn't trying to call for help. She was just looking down, as if watching some scene in a movie." Emily's voice trembled when she added, "It was so unnatural that at that moment I couldn't even immediately realize how strange it was. Even stranger seemed the girl's behavior on the day when the family's pet, the cat Marcel, disappeared." The father, James, told the investigation, "Emily and I were very upset because Marcel was part of the family. Danny cried almost the entire evening. I asked Lily if she had seen the cat, and she calmly answered, 'He ran away to the forest.' There was no excitement in her voice, no regret. She said it as if it was about some trifle. And immediately after that, she simply turned around and went to draw." These details, seemingly insignificant at first glance, began to form a clear picture. And this picture was very disturbing. In all difficult situations when other family members showed emotions, fear, panic, grief, Lily invariably remained completely calm. This was not just noticeable, it was alarming. It seemed as if what was happening had no meaning for her at all, as if all these events passed by her. New notes appeared in the protocols. Absence of emotional reaction to traumatic events. These words sounded formal, dry, but behind them lay a much deeper and more disturbing meaning. The investigators understood that the girl's behavior went far beyond ordinary childhood restraint or withdrawal. It looked as if Lily was completely devoid of empathy, the ability to feel another's pain, to sympathize, to worry about others. It was precisely at this moment of the investigation that the need for serious psychological expertise arose. The investigators decided that if they wanted to get answers to questions that were becoming increasingly acute and frightening, they had to look deeper inside the consciousness of this quiet 8-year-old girl. The examination was supposed to give a clear answer to the main question of the investigation. Was Lily simply withdrawn and emotionally closed? Or did her indifference hide something more serious and frightening? And if so, what exactly was happening in the head of the girl, who until recently everyone considered an ordinary child, but now perceived as the central figure of the strange and disturbing story of the Greer family? The investigators no longer doubted that Lily's calmness was not simply a coincidence or character trait, but the main discovery was the report of the social worker sent to the Greer family to observe the atmosphere in the house after the incident. The social worker, Elizabeth Parker, spent several days in the house, trying to understand what the family's life actually looked like. Elizabeth had seen many different families and different children. But her report began with a phrase that attracted the attention of absolutely everyone who was conducting the investigation. Subject Lily Greer demonstrates unusual behavior, manifested in constant observation of family members, especially parents, with peripheral vision. At the same time, the girl carefully creates the impression of being immersed in play, drawing, or reading. But as soon as any of the adults directs a direct gaze at her, Lily instantly changes her facial expression to neutral or shy. I got the impression that she carefully monitors those around her, while not wanting to be noticed. Such conclusions looked frightening, especially considering the previous testimonies of parents and neighbors. What was hidden behind this behavior? After all, children are usually either open and spontaneous or shy and withdrawn, but they never build complex behavioral strategies and control their emotions with such precision and methodicalness. Elizabeth also noted one particularly disturbing episode. One evening, when the whole family was watching television, I observed Lily sitting a little to the side. She was playing with a doll, but her eyes constantly and imperceptibly followed her parents. When her father suddenly turned in her direction, Lily literally changed her concentrated, tense expression to absolutely innocent in a split second, like a mask, and smiled at her father. It looked so unnatural that I felt uncomfortable. The girl clearly understood what facial expression would be appropriate in this or that situation, and easily used this. It was precisely this phrase in the report that finally changed the perception of Lily. It became obvious that her behavior was not spontaneous or accidental. On the contrary, it was thoughtful, conscious, and adaptive. She consciously controlled how others perceived her, as if each of her actions was carefully calculated. Investigators and psychologists now spoke not simply about oddities in the behavior of an 8-year-old girl, but about a possible manipulative personality disorder. This was much more serious than simply withdrawal or lack of empathy. Lily apparently possessed the ability to accurately and unerringly assess the mood and reactions of others and adjust her behavior in such a way as never to arouse suspicion. Now no one doubted that these were not simply childish pranks or coincidences. Before them was not a quiet, shy child, but a person capable of consciously influencing her environment, skillfully hiding her true intentions. And this discovery entailed the next inevitable step: a deep psychological examination of Lily, the results of which could give a definitive answer to the main question: who really was this girl who became the center of the mysterious and frightening story of the Greer family? The investigators knew that psychological examination could shed light on Lily's behavioral oddities, but they needed something more concrete. They needed real evidence that could confirm their most disturbing suspicions. That is why the police decided to conduct a repeat, much more thorough search of the house, and this time attention was completely focused on the girl's room. At first glance, Lily's room was no different from the bedrooms of other children her age. A neatly made bed, a small desk with albums and pencils, a bookshelf with children's books and toys. But now the investigators knew that they should look not on the surface, but deeper. Literally deeper. It was under one of the floorboards in the far corner of the room, practically hidden from prying eyes by a small carpet, that the police discovered a neatly arranged hiding place. This discovery immediately changed the direction of the investigation. Now they knew for certain that Lily was hiding something, that she had secrets that she carefully protected from everyone, even from her own parents. There were only a few items in the hiding place, but each of them immediately acquired enormous significance for the investigation. The first thing that the criminologists extracted from there was a collar with a small silver bell, the very one that once belonged to the missing family cat, Marcel. This object in itself was already alarming because the girl claimed that the cat had simply run away. How did the collar end up under her floorboard? The second item was a small key that at first glance represented nothing special, but later when investigators compared it with the lock of the medicine cabinet where the father's medications were stored, everything fell into place. This was the very key that, according to Emily, was always on her key ring. How Lily was able to get it remained a separate question. But more importantly, now the police had direct evidence of the girl's access to medications. And finally, the third and perhaps most frightening item turned out to be an ordinary children's drawing made with colored pencils. It was precisely this that made the investigators finally reconsider all previous versions. The drawing depicted the GirI family house, with precision down to details. Large windows, a familiar staircase leading to the second floor. But important were not the details, but the figures depicted in the drawing. One of them, a small, clearly childish figure, was depicted falling down the stairs. The second figure, slightly larger, stood at the top of the stairs and calmly observed the fall, not trying to help, not trying to stop it. Simply observed. The figures had no faces, instead, empty ovals, like masks, behind which it was impossible to make out real emotions. But everyone who saw the drawing immediately understood who exactly was depicted in this disturbing children's picture. This find was no longer just indirect evidence or suspicion. The drawing connected Lily to the incidents directly and became the first material evidence that what was happening in the GirI family house was not simply a series of coincidences. Now the police understood that the events could be much more sinister and planned than anyone could have supposed. The investigators faced a new, even more complex task. How to conduct the investigation further now, when the suspect was an 8-year-old girl capable of planning her actions so coldly and thoroughly. Now, when the investigators received direct confirmation linking Lily to the incidents, they had a new question, no less complex and frightening. What exactly was going on in the consciousness of the 8-year-old girl? Was her behavior simply the result of poor upbringing and a difficult past? Or was there something much more serious behind all this? To get answers, experts from the Forensic Psychiatric Commission were brought into the case. For several days, psychologists and psychiatrists observed Lily, conducted conversations with her, tests and analyzed her drawings, games, and manner of communication. And here are excerpts from the official conclusion that impressed even seasoned investigators. The subject demonstrates a pronounced absence of empathy. In situations where sympathy or an emotional response is expected from her, Lily shows complete emotional neutrality. When describing events that caused stress or trauma to other people, the girl shows no signs of emotional involvement. For her, these events are neutral and devoid of emotional content. The following excerpt sounded even more unsettling. A low capacity for forming stable emotional attachments is noted. The subject easily establishes contact with others, but relationships remain superficial. Interaction with other people is often built on a manipulative basis. Lily uses behavior, facial expressions, and gestures to achieve specific goals and obtain desired results. But the most unexpected part of the report concerned the level of action, planning, which completely did not correspond to the girl's age. Special attention should be paid to the extremely high, age-inappropriate level of planning and organization of actions. In everyday behavior, the subject shows thoughtfulness and control characteristic of a much older age. All of Lily's actions are conscious, calculating, devoid of spontaneity or impulsiveness typical of her age group. The expert's conclusion ended with words that definitively changed the perception of Lily by investigators and everyone who had access to this report. Although a definitive diagnosis cannot be established within the framework of the current examination, the subject's behavior clearly indicates serious deviations in personality development. The observed behavioral characteristics are not typical childhood mischief or ordinary emotional problems. Instead, they reflect deep, possibly innate, personality disorders requiring long-term observation and correction. Thus, what was recently perceived by everyone as strange or even alarming but still childish behavior now had a completely different explanation Lily's actions were not just childish whims or the result of a lack of attention and love. The investigation faced a person demonstrating pronounced traits of a manipulative disorder, capable of carefully and coldly controlling her behavior and influencing others to achieve her own goals. From this moment, the investigation reached a new level. Investigators had to understand not just motives or specific actions, but to look much deeper, to understand what exactly drove Lily and what else she might be capable of. After all, now they knew they were dealing not just with a child, but with a person whose actions could not be predicted, but had to be managed before a new tragedy occurred. But just when it seemed that the investigators had almost completely unraveled this dark story, a new detail emerged that turned the case upside down. Yes, Lily clearly had serious problems. But could an 8-year-old girl herself without outside help come up with such cruel acts? Or perhaps someone prompted her, taught her. The police decided to check the girl's past, which until then seemed less significant. Investigators went to the orphanage from where Lily had been taken into the GirI family several months earlier, and there, among the archives and protocols, something very important was discovered. The orphanage caregivers remembered Lily well, and they all repeated roughly the same thing. Quiet, calm, always keeping to herself from other children. But among the testimonies was one important detail that no one had paid attention to before. Yes, Lily was always withdrawn, former caregiver Sarah Peterson told investigators. But about a year before she was adopted, she made a friend. His name was Nathan, and he was 3 years older than Lily. Nathan's name immediately interested the investigators, and it soon became clear that the boy had been adopted about 6 months before Lily joined the GirI family. But most importantly, it turned out that Nathan, according to records in the orphanage archives, was far from a simple child. He had already had documented episodes of cruel behavior, especially towards animals. One of the caregivers explicitly said, "Nathan could be charming, but we noticed disturbing signs in him. Once he treated a kitten cruelly, and after that, we started watching him more closely." This discovery was unsettling. On the one hand, Lily's behavior alone already raised serious concerns. On the other hand, now a person had appeared in the case who could have influenced her. Investigators began actively checking a new version. What if the girl was not the sole culprit of what happened? What if her behavior was merely a reflection or even a copy of the actions of an older companion? Sarah Peterson confirmed that Nathan and Lily spent a lot of time together, but their communication rarely caught the eye of adults. They always played aside, talking quietly. "We thought he was taking care of her like an older brother. Now, of course, I realize we might have missed something important." Now the investigation faced a new challenge: to understand how deeply Nathan's influence had penetrated Lily's mind. Perhaps the girl was just repeating what she had learned from him behind the closed doors of the orphanage. Or did she herself decide to go down this path? An acquaintance with Nathan only pushed her towards what was already brewing in her mind. These questions were complex, but investigators had to find answers before drawing any final conclusions. Soon they found out that Nathan lived only a few blocks from the GirI family, in a neighboring district. And this meant that now they had to meet him personally. After all, much depended on what Lily's former friend would say. The investigation was entering a new phase, and its outcome was becoming less and less predictable. The meeting with Nathan was supposed to shed light on many details, but investigators already understood that it was not just about him. Nathan could be a catalyst, but Lily's behavioral patterns had formed much earlier, and the key to understanding her actions was her own past. What happened long before the girl came to the GirI family? When the investigation gained access to Lily's personal file from the orphanage, the picture became even darker. On the surface, everything looked quite standard. A typical characterization written by the caregivers sounded like this: quiet, withdrawn, non-confrontational. And indeed, at first glance, the girl did not stand out in any way. But there was something else in the orphanage materials that made the police look more closely at her past. Periodically, short memos appeared in Lily's personal file, which at the time, no one took seriously. One of the caregivers reported, "This morning it was discovered that several children's personal belongings were damaged, torn clothes, broken toys. There is no direct evidence of Lily's involvement, but the girl was the only one who showed no surprise or alarm when discussing what happened." The next memo was even more alarming. A hamster disappeared from the pet corner. The children were upset, helped search for the animal. Lily did not participate, looked indifferent. No direct evidence against her was found. Similar episodes were repeated several times. Small incidents, minor disappearances, broken things. And Lily was always somewhere nearby, but in such a way that no one could unambiguously link it to her. The caregivers even held several conversations with the girl, trying to understand if she was a victim of bullying or conflict with other children. However, Lily always answered calmly and briefly, "No, I'm fine." Neither fear nor anxiety, only an even voice and an attentive, scrutinizing gaze. These conversations yielded no results, and eventually the caregivers decided that the problem was either with other children or entirely due to random coincidences. Lily was again left aside. However, now that the police had the opportunity to compare these episodes with what was happening in the GirI family, the picture became absolutely clear. The missing pet cat, Danny's fall down the stairs, the poisoning. All of this had happened before, just in different forms and with different people. The girl's behavioral pattern was not just similar, it was absolutely identical. Lily, both in the orphanage and now in her new family, always remained aloof, calmly observing the consequences of her actions. She showed neither aggression nor regret, did not demonstrate the emotions expected of a child in such situations. And most importantly, she always remained innocent in the eyes of others. There was never any direct evidence of her guilt, and it was precisely this that made her behavior particularly disturbing and unpredictable. Now the investigators knew for sure. It was not about the new home, not about the new parents, and not even about Nathan's influence. The GirI family was simply a new environment in which Lily's old behavioral patterns, formed long before adoption, manifested themselves. The house on White Oak Drive was just a stage for the continuation of that story, the beginning of which was hidden in the quiet corridors of the orphanage. This discovery significantly complicated the case, as investigators now needed to understand how to work with a person whose behavior had been formed long before they even knew of her existence, how to protect others and prevent the possible consequences of what had long taken deep root in Lily's mind. The next stage of the investigation was to provide answers to these questions and determine what steps needed to be taken so that the story, which began in the girl's distant past, would not lead to new tragedies in the future. When investigators realized that Lily's behavior was not just a series of coincidences, but a formed behavior pattern, they decided to act directly. They needed to see how the girl would react if her calm was challenged for the first time, a direct confrontation with irrefutable evidence. The interrogation room was quiet. On one side of the table sat Lily, neatly dressed with straight posture, her hands calmly resting on her knees. Opposite her was Detective Catherine Miller, an experienced investigator known for her tough but effective approach. In the corner, a psychologist sat quietly, carefully observing every one of the girl's gestures. Catherine began calmly but immediately got to the point. "Lily, do you remember the drawing we found in your room?" She slowly pushed a sheet of paper across the table with a child's drawing of stairs, a house, and two figures. Lily didn't even look at the drawing, just quietly replied, almost in a whisper, "I didn't draw that." Her voice was even, devoid of emotion, and it sounded almost too convincing for a child her age. Catherine exchanged glances with the psychologist, then continued, maintaining a stern expression. "But it's your room, Lily." The drawing was hidden where no one else could have put it. Lily again showed no emotion, made no attempt to justify or explain. She just quietly repeated, "I didn't draw it." The detective paused, as if giving Lily a chance to think, but the girl didn't take it. She sat just as straight, calm, looking somewhere over Catherine's shoulder. The next piece of evidence was a small key, and the detective carefully placed it on the table in front of Lily. "This key is for your father's medicine cabinet. Do you know how it ended up with you?" Lily shifted her gaze to the key as if seeing it for the first time. There was no fear, surprise, or even curiosity in her eyes. She answered evenly as before. "I found it on the floor." "When did you find it, Lily?" "I don't remember." Her answers remained just as short and neutral, as if she wasn't answering serious investigative questions, but simply politely chatting about the weather. This calm, completely out of place for the situation, began to irritate even the seasoned Detective Miller. Finally, a collar appeared on the table, the very one, with a small silver bell that belonged to the cat Marcel. "Do you know what this is, Lily?" The detective's voice became slightly harsher. Lily looked at the collar, tilting her head slightly to the side as if remembering something insignificant and not too important. "Yes, it's Marcel's collar. He lost it when he ran away." "How do you know he lost it then?" "Because I found the collar in the yard after he disappeared." The investigator stared intently at the girl, trying to catch the slightest hint of emotion. Nervousness, fear, regret. But there was nothing of the sort. Only confidence and calm, completely unsuitable for her age. The interrogation continued for some time, but Lily's answers remained unchanged. Her voice didn't tremble, her eyes didn't wander, her hands didn't betray anxiety. She repeated her story without deviations or contradictions. It seemed that the investigators were facing not an 8-year-old girl, but an experienced adult who had prepared in advance for any questions and was not going to give up. Eventually, the interrogation reached a dead end. No new information or confessions were obtained. But it was this icy, impenetrable calm with which Lily withstood the confrontation that became the most important result of the meeting. Now the investigators were sure of one thing. They were dealing not just with a girl with problems or a difficult past, but with a person possessing almost incredible self-control and cold rationality. A person capable of firmly sticking to her version, even in the face of irrefutable evidence. Her reaction, the complete absence of any emotional reaction, became the main proof for the investigation of how dangerous this child could be. But now the main question remained, to which an answer still had to be found. What to do next? After all, formally, the investigation only had circumstantial evidence, and the girl sitting in front of them seemed invulnerable to pressure or persuasion. From this moment on, the investigation had to go in a completely different direction. Now they needed to understand not only what Lily had done, but also how to protect others from her in the future. The investigation had almost reached a dead end, encountering Lily's icy calm and impenetrable answers. It seemed she had foreseen everything down to the smallest detail, carefully hiding any direct evidence. But there was one thing the girl couldn't have thought of: a digital footprint that cannot be completely erased or faked. Technical experts gained access to an old family tablet, which Lily had occasionally used in recent months. The parents didn't even consider that important information might have been preserved on it. After all, they regularly deleted search history, trying to protect their children from unnecessary content. But specialists knew that a digital footprint never completely disappears, and they managed to restore the deleted data. And when they received the first results, It became a real breakthrough for the investigation. The recovered search history looked terrifying. What dose of sleeping pills is dangerous for a 6-year-old? The query was made 3 days before the incident with Danny's poisoning. How to make a fall down the stairs look accidental? This question appeared in the search history one day before the boy ended up in the hospital with a bruise. But the earliest query, made 1 week before the cat's disappearance, was particularly alarming. Where do cats from private homes disappear to? Now the investigators had what they had been lacking: direct evidence that all 3 incidents were not just a chain of random events, but the result of conscious and carefully planned intent. Lily might have remained outwardly calm and impenetrable, but the digital footprint was absolutely irrefutable. From this moment on, the case ceased to be merely a suspicion. Before the investigators lay evidence capable of finally changing the course of the investigation and leading to concrete actions. Questions about the girl's guilt and responsibility were now only a matter of time. The investigators knew. Now comes the most difficult stage: to understand what to do next with a child capable of such frightening cold-bloodedness and cunning. The investigators now knew. Before them was a girl capable of cold-blooded and calculated actions, meticulously planned and thought through to the smallest detail. But one final step remained: to present her with irrefutable evidence and see how she would react when denial was no longer an option. Detective Catherine Miller conducted the interrogation again. She did not waste time on introductions or unnecessary questions. Placing the tablet on the table, the detective slowly and clearly read out the recovered search queries. What dose of sleeping pills is dangerous for a 6-year-old child? The query was made 3 days before the incident with Danny. For the first time during all the interrogations, Lily looked up and stared directly into the detective's eyes. How to make a fall down the stairs look accidental? This query was made 1 day before your brother fell. Silence hung in the room, and for the first time in the entire investigation, a change occurred in Lily's behavior. She no longer averted her eyes, no longer looked away. Instead, her gaze was direct, cold, and utterly devoid of emotion. The detective continued. And the last query: where do cats from private homes disappear to? This was 1 week before Marcel's disappearance. She fell silent, carefully observing Lily's reaction. A silence settled in the room that no one dared to break. The girl remained silent. Silent for a long time. The protocol would later record: the subject ceased looking away. Established direct eye contact with the investigator. Remained silent for 1 minute, 27 seconds. Almost 1.5 minutes of absolute silence that seemed endless. Finally, Lily slowly blinked as if waking from a long sleep. No fear or panic appeared in her eyes, only a cold and assessing gaze directed straight at Detective Miller. Then the girl, calmly, almost indifferently, said, "I will not say anything." These were the last words the investigation heard from Lily. There was no confession, no excuses, not even the slightest hint of remorse. Instead, her gaze remained just as steady, as cold, as if she were completely detached from everything happening. For Detective Miller and her colleagues, this reaction was no less significant than a confession of guilt. It was at this moment that it became absolutely clear that the girl perfectly understood what she had done but felt not the slightest pang of conscience. She simply made the decision not to speak, knowing that any words from her would be useless. The interrogation ended. Lily silently stood up and calmly followed the psychologist, who led her out of the room. No one doubted that they were dealing with a person capable not only of committing the acts they had learned about, but also of coldly enduring any accusations and evidence against herself. The case was ready for referral to court. Now the judicial system had to decide what to do next with an 8-year-old girl who, in fact, turned out to be a far more complex and terrifying personality than anyone could have anticipated. The investigators could only wait and hope that this was the last such case in their practice, although they perfectly understood that after this case, nothing would ever be the same. Now that all the evidence had been collected, the investigators were able to reconstruct the full picture of what had been happening in the Griers' home all these months. Each episode, which had seemed accidental, now became an element of a carefully planned chain of actions. It all began with the disappearance of the cat, Marcel. In the evening, Lily called him to the backyard, as she had done many times before. Only this time, the cat never returned. Calmly removing the collar and hiding it in a secret compartment under the floor in her room, the girl then told her parents that the cat had simply run off into the woods. No one doubted her words. Several weeks later, the second episode occurred. Lily quietly stood at the top of the stairs and calmly waited for Danny to pass by. One neat, barely noticeable movement, and her brother ended up on the floor with a head injury. Parents and doctors attributed everything to ordinary childish carelessness, and once again suspicions bypassed Lily. The next step was even more thought out. The girl carefully stole the key to the medicine cabinet from her mother's keyring, doing it so discreetly that no one suspected anything. She kept the key herself until the right moment, patiently waiting for a suitable opportunity. Before the most serious act, Lily used the family tablet to find out what dose of the drug could be dangerous for her brother. She entered several queries, ensured the accuracy of her calculations, and coldly proceeded to implement her plan. On that fateful evening, when the family was having dinner, Lily calmly and discreetly added the necessary number of pills to Danny's juice. She did it quickly, precisely, without unnecessary movements, without arousing any suspicion from her parents. This reconstruction of actions showed that the investigation was dealing not just with a child, but with a person capable of contemplating and executing a sequence of complex actions with frightening methodicalness. No impulsive acts, no coincidences, only cold calculation and absolute control over the situation. The investigators were finally convinced. Every event that had seemed like an accident was part of the same design, which belonged to the 8-year-old girl. Now it was up to the court to make a final decision on this unprecedented case. When the case reached court, the main question was not whether Lily was guilty, but how to deal with a person who, despite her age, proved capable of such coldness and calculation. The courtroom was overflowing. The girl's parents gave heavy testimonies, avoiding looking in her direction. Their voices trembled with emotion and despair as they stated they could not even imagine what their daughter was capable of. Psychologists presented a detailed report to the court, confirming severe personality disorders and a complete lack of empathy in Lily. The prosecution insisted the girl's actions were conscious, planned, and methodical. Every piece of evidence was meticulously presented, and each proof emphasized that this was not a childish prank, but an intentional crime. The defense, in turn, tried to draw attention to Lily's difficult past, to the fact that her age did not allow her actions to be perceived in the same way as an adult's. The lawyer insisted that the girl needed help, not punishment. The court deliberated for a long time, understanding the full complexity and unprecedented nature of the situation. Finally, the verdict was announced, which fully corresponded to the harsh reality of the case. Considering the age and psychological state of the defendant, criminal punishment is deemed impossible. However, to ensure the safety of others and the defendant herself, the court orders her compulsory treatment in a closed psychiatric facility for minors until she reaches 21 years of age. After this, the term will be reviewed based on specialists' recommendations. Thus, the law closed the legal part of this story. But the verdict was not the end. Now the main question remained. Could anyone understand what was going on in the girl's mind? And could the recurrence of such events be prevented in the future? This was the question the investigation intended to pursue further. The case was officially closed, but the story of the GirI family never truly ended. The younger brother, Danny, survived the incident, but a long and difficult rehabilitation awaited him. He managed to recover physically, but the emotional wounds remained with him forever. For the parents, this tragedy also left its mark. Almost immediately after the trial, they terminated the adoption agreement, sold their house on White Oak Drive, and moved to another state, trying to escape the past. But the events of those days affected their relationship too deeply. 2 years after the trial, they finally divorced. And Lily still remains in a closed treatment facility. According to the latest doctor's reports, she has never shown remorse and still avoids contact with therapists. The most alarming thing in this entire story is that the term of her stay in the facility remains open. And no one can yet say what will happen on the day the doors open for her again. July 12th, 2021. The setting is Pietrablanca, a small Argentinian town where it seems nothing more serious than a bar fight ever happens. But then, in the middle of the night, on the road leading directly to the center, a girl appears. Thin, disheveled, with bruises on her arms and legs, barefoot, in a home t-shirt and shorts. She runs without looking back, only forward, towards the glowing lights of the central square. I catch myself thinking, this is truly a story that is hard to comprehend until you see it with your own eyes. This girl's name is Sofia Sanchez. She is 16 years old, and this is not a typical teenage runaway story, as often happens in such tales. She is running to survive, to tell what no one wanted to hear for years. When she reaches the town center, the first thing Sofia does is head straight to the police station. She doesn't knock. She literally flies inside, throwing open the doors, and immediately collapses to her knees from exhaustion and pain. There are only 2 police officers on duty. They jump up to her, thinking she was hit by a car or attacked right on the street. But what the officers will hear in literally 1 minute will make them forget everything that came before. Sofia can barely speak. She cries. Her breath is ragged, her words are jumbled. From what can be deciphered, one thing is clear. Her parents, Juan and Elena Sanchez, the very ones everyone in Pietrablanca knows as local philanthropists, an exemplary couple who adopted several children, turn out to be not at all who the community believed them to be. But on this night, no one yet comprehends the scale of the catastrophe. While the officers bring her water while Sofia tries to calm down, everyone already in the station asks themselves one question. From whom was she running so desperately? And the answer, which will come a little later, will turn the life of the entire town upside down. When the residents of Pietrablanca woke up on the morning of July 13th, the world looked absolutely normal to them. A small Argentinian town with a population of just over 2,000 people lives by its unhurried laws. Open a small shop in the morning, go to the market, sit in a cafe in the central square in the evening. Everyone knows everyone else. Everyone is aware of who is whose relative and who is whose friend. Therefore, when it came to the Sanchez family, no one had any questions. Everyone was sure. Juan and Elena were perhaps the best thing that had happened to the town in the last 10 years. If you opened any local newspaper from the last year, you could find a photo of the Sanchez couple in almost every issue. Here they are, smiling at the opening of a new library, built with their funds. And here's a family photo at the annual town festival. Juan stands next to the mayor. Elena hugs the children. 4 children, 3 boys and a girl named Sofia, all neatly dressed, smiling, looking happy and completely ordinary. Just as children in a prosperous family should be. This image was the true face of the Sanchez family for the entire town. Juan, a tall man in his mid-40s, always in perfectly ironed shirts, and with a smile that made it impossible to suspect anything bad. When he went out, he could easily stop and talk to a neighbor, ask about his mother's health, or offer help if someone in town was having a hard time. Elena was the complete opposite. Quiet, calm, always by her husband's side, always in elegant dresses and with a soft, almost maternal voice. She was responsible for charitable projects, visited orphanages, and participated in town meetings. In 2012, the couple adopted their first 2 children. At the time, this event became a local sensation. Newspapers wrote about the family's generosity, and people on the streets, watching them pass, said that Juan and Elena were probably saints. And when 3 years later they took in 2 more, including Sofia, the Sanchez family was already spoken of in town as an example of absolute goodness and mercy. The family home, a beautiful mansion on the outskirts, became a symbol of what family happiness should look like. White walls, a perfectly manicured lawn, flowers on the windows. Outside, a dream picture inside. 4 children who, it seemed, were surrounded by care and love. The Sanchez children rarely appeared at schools or town events. The explanation was simple and clear. The family paid great attention to homeschooling and frequent trips around the country. At such times, it seemed that the Sanchez children were luckier than anyone else in Pietrablanca. And now this image, ideal, flawless, and so familiar, collapsed in one night. While the residents were not yet awake, while the town had not yet begun its usual morning ritual, Sofia had already told the police what simply did not fit into the usual picture. But on the morning of July 13th, no one in town knew about it yet. When people take to the streets in the morning, the first rumors about Sofia's nighttime visit to the police will already begin to spread through the town. In cafes and shops, people will start whispering about what happened to the girl and what happened to that perfect family picture. At first, no one will believe it, because Sanchez is a good name, a symbol of local decency and prosperity. But the question that will soon face the entire town is, how is such a thing even possible? And where does the truth end and the terrible secret begin? The first rumors that spread through the streets of Pietrablanca on the morning of July 13th seemed like gossip that no one could believe. How could anyone imagine that behind the flawless facade of the Sanchez family lay something so terrible that even the police themselves didn't immediately grasp its magnitude? But rumors are one thing, and official documents are quite another. And in them, if you look, everything was very specific and crystal clear. Here are the dry lines from Sofia Sanchez's first interrogation protocol, from the very girl who ran barefoot to the station the night before. July 13, 2021, 0023. Complainant: Sofia Sanchez, 16 years old. According to the complainant, my adoptive parents, Juan and Elena Sanchez, regularly inflict pain upon us. I and 3 other children are held in the house against our will. We are forbidden to go outside to communicate with anyone except our parents. We are constantly punished physically and mentally. There used to be 5 of us, but one of us disappeared. The parents said he went to another city, but we don't believe them. These words, written in the steady official hand of the duty officer, instantly transformed the situation from a mere teenage runaway into a serious criminal case. The officers who took the statement had long struggled to believe what they heard. The Sanchez family, exemplary residents, philanthropists, visible to everyone in town, turned out to be involved in a completely different, far less appealing story. Sofia kept crying as she recounted the details. She could barely look at the police, embarrassed by the bruises on her arms and legs. All this time she repeated the same thing. You have to get the others. They are in the house now and something will definitely happen to them. The girl desperately tried to explain that her brothers were left completely alone at home, and that if her parents noticed her escape, everything would get even worse. But the most disturbing part of her story was that there was once another child in the Sanchez home, a 5th adopted son whom no one had seen for a long time. Sofia herself said his name was Luis, and that her parents had simply announced one day, "Luis has gone to live in Buenos Aires." But after that incident, the children in the house never spoke his name again. They simply remained silent because they understood that talking about Luis was forbidden. But now Sofia had decided to speak about it for the first time. When the police tried to carefully ascertain the details of how exactly the parents treated the children, Sofia fell silent, only lowered her gaze, and quietly uttered, "You cannot even imagine how much pain we endured." And after that, no matter how hard the officers tried to find out anything else, the girl spoke with difficulty, choosing her words carefully as if afraid that her parents would somehow hear her even there. The police had no doubts left. Sofia's words were entered into the official protocol, and this meant that the Sanchez case was now not just a family conflict or a teenage runaway, but a serious criminal investigation. The protocol was immediately assigned a number, and the information was forwarded to the precinct chief. Within an hour, the case, which included the words "missing child" and "physical punishment," was on the desk of the head of the local police. Thus, a single statement made by a girl late at night initiated a case that would soon shake the entire town and change everything people knew and thought about the Sanchez family. But at that moment, the police did not yet suspect how dark the reality hidden behind the beautiful facades of their ideal home on the outskirts of town would turn out to be. The official investigation would begin that same day, and within a few hours, the police would cross the threshold of the Sanchez home for the first time, where, behind the perfect walls, lay the answers to all the questions Pietrablanca was so afraid to ask itself. That same day, literally a few hours after Sofia's words, the police were already at the Sanchez home. Usually such visits look routine. A patrol car pulls up, knocks on the door, asks standard questions. But this time, everything was different. Because in every officer's mind, the girl's words about what was happening behind the closed doors of that house were already swirling. The Sanchez house looked impeccable. A large white mansion on the outskirts of Pietrablanca, neatly trimmed bushes, flower beds at the entrance. It seemed that there simply could not be anything criminal here. But when the patrol approached the front door, the police suddenly hesitated. They knew that behind this perfect door, something was likely hidden that was difficult to imagine even in the worst-case scenario. A knock. Juan Sanchez himself opened the door. And that is when something began that perhaps no one expected to see immediately after such serious accusations. Juan met the police calmly and with a smile, as if he had been expecting their visit. He even shook hands with the officers, whom he knew quite well personally, as the town is small. Everyone knows everyone. "Good day, officers." "To what do I owe this visit?" Juan asked, looking at the police as if it were a routine document check. When they told him about Sofia's statement, his face did not change. He did not start to get nervous, nor did he try to avoid the conversation. He simply shrugged and softly said, "You know, teenagers, Sofia is at a difficult age right now. She often makes up stories. Everything is fine with us. She is just an overly emotional girl." And it sounded logical. It sounded like the truth, if it weren't for those desperate eyes of Sofia at the station, which the police could not forget. The officers insisted that they needed to inspect the house. Juan agreed without objection, only adding that he was very sorry about the misunderstanding and was sure that Sofia would soon explain everything herself. But when the police crossed the threshold, the very first detail made them wary. The house was perfect on the outside, but inside there was a palpable, oppressive silence. Strange and almost unnatural for a house where children live. There were no voices, no laughter, not even the usual noise of a television. An empty, immaculate living room with perfectly tidy armchairs and a sofa. Ideal order, as if a cleaning service had just left. And again, the officers could not understand why a house with 4 children looked so empty. When the police asked to see the children, Juan nodded briefly and led them upstairs. The children were sitting in one room, all three of them, and it immediately became clear that something was wrong with them. This was not the picture of a happy family that neighbors and journalists were accustomed to seeing at city festivals. These were three frightened, withdrawn children who, upon the appearance of strangers, did not even try to smile or say hello. They sat in complete silence, barely looking at the police, not answering questions, only occasionally glancing fearfully at Juan, who stood by the door. The officers noted that the children looked tired, withdrawn, neatly dressed, but clearly in ill-fitting clothes, as if put on in a hurry. The house had an atmosphere of unseen tension, although outwardly everything seemed as flawless as always. The police tried to talk to the children, to ask how they were doing, but every question was met with silence and frightened glances. Juan carefully monitored every word, and the officers felt how the children literally recoiled from his presence. It was clear that they would not be able to speak openly in such conditions. When the police finished their inspection and were leaving the house, Juan politely escorted them to the door and apologized again for the inconvenience. He was still as calm, still as self-assured. But now his confidence looked somehow suspicious. Outside in the car, the officers exchanged silent glances. They could not shake the feeling that what they had seen indirectly confirmed Sofia's words. They found no traces of a crime in the house, saw no direct evidence of cruelty. But these children, withdrawn, frightened, unlike a happy family, became the first and most important clue, confirming that something was clearly wrong in the Sanchez home. It was the children's condition that became the starting point, after which the Sanchez case could no longer be closed, citing simple teenage fantasies. Now the police were sure. The investigation was just beginning, and the next step had to be taken very quickly before something irreversible happened in the house on the outskirts of the city. In such stories, there always comes a moment when another version of events emerges. And now not everything is so obvious. Not everything is so simple. If until now Sofia, her words, and her fear were in the spotlight, now those against whom she spoke took the floor. 2 days after the police visit to the Sanchez home, Juan and Elena were summoned to the station for an official conversation. At first they looked a little surprised, but their calm demeanor did not leave them. They behaved as if they had simply come to clarify another misunderstanding, as if their daughter, the same one who ran to the police barefoot in the middle of the night, had once again caused some trouble. Juan spoke first, and it was a completely different version of events. Calm, well thought out, and it sounded so logical that for a second doubts even arose. You see, Sofia is a very difficult teenager. She has always been prone to dramatization, to making things up. Perhaps this is how the trauma of her early childhood manifests itself. Elena and I are doing everything we can to help her, but she has run away from home many times, invented stories to attract attention. This is just another one of her attempts to get attention. And everything Juan said sounded convincing, even sincere. The police began to wonder, what if it really was like that? After all, outwardly the Sanchez family was exemplary. Was it possible that Sofia simply exaggerated? After all, sometimes teenagers really go to extremes, especially when it comes to adopted children. When asked about the condition of the other children, Elena softly, almost sadly, smiled and added, "You saw how they look, and perhaps that alarmed you. But these are all the consequences of illness. We adopted them. They were very weak. They have had health problems from the very beginning. We are investing a lot of effort and resources to get them back on their feet, but such things are not resolved quickly. And yes, sometimes they are indeed withdrawn, afraid of strangers. But this is the result of their difficult past, not of what is happening in our home." And again, everything sounded logical. A family that adopted sick children, investing their strength, time, money into them. Who would want to doubt such a beautiful and touching story? But the police were forced to record everything they heard from Juan and Elena. Their words were officially recorded in the protocol. July 15th, 2021. Testimony of citizen Juan Sanchez. Sofia often stages such scenes. She has a vivid imagination. We are already used to such situations, but this time she went too far. Testimony of citizen Elena Sanchez. The other children look unwell exclusively due to chronic illnesses. We regularly consult with doctors, but they have not fully recovered. Sofia simply took advantage of this to add drama to her words. These lines, written in clear handwriting, sharply contradicted everything Sofia had told. Now there were officially two versions of one story. Two perspectives on the same life, in which Sofia appeared either as a victim or a liar. At some point, the police even considered checking the children's medical records. But before they could do anything, a phrase was uttered that finally alarmed everyone. Juan unexpectedly returned to the topic of the missing boy, the very Luis whom Sofia had already mentioned. As for Luis, whom she mentioned, Juan continued, "It's even simpler. Luis no longer lives with us. He returned to relatives in Buenos Aires. This is easy to verify." The words were spoken confidently with the same calm smile, but an awkward silence followed them. For some reason, this version sounded too rehearsed, too smooth to be true. Nevertheless, the police did not yet have direct evidence to accuse the Sanchez couple directly. Their words formally explained all the questions raised by Sofia, but it was already too late to reverse anything. Sofia's accusations, her tears, and that nighttime escape were too serious to simply close the case by saying that the girl made it up. Juan and Elena Sanchez were officially designated as suspects. Yes, they did not yet look like criminals, but like people who were victims of teenage hysteria. But this was only one of two possible realities, and the police had to find out which one was real. All that remained for the police was to start looking for evidence that could confirm or refute the words of Sofia's adoptive parents. It was clear that the truth lay somewhere deeper, and that was where they had to dig. Literally and figuratively. Words are one thing, but it is another when the house itself begins to speak. The Sanchezes were convincing. The right words, the right emotions. Everything looked plausible, until the police decided to take a closer look inside. The search was quickly arranged, and when the officers re-entered the Sanchez's home, they already knew what they were looking for. Literally everything had to be checked, from the rooms where the children lived to the couple's personal belongings. In such cases, details matter, small things that at first glance seem insignificant. And after just a few minutes, it became clear that there were simply no insignificant details here. From the outside, the Sanchez's house was still that ideal home straight out of a glossy magazine. But once you went up to the second floor where the children's bedrooms were located, the picture changed dramatically. The first thing the police noticed was the massive metal bars installed on the windows of all the children's rooms. Such bars are usually placed on bank windows or in particularly dangerous areas, but certainly not in children's bedrooms. It seemed they were installed specifically so that none of the occupants of these rooms could go outside on their own. This completely contradicted Juan and Elena's words about trusting family relationships. Inside the rooms, the scene only grew darker. Furniture was almost entirely absent. In each room, there was exactly the same thing: a mattress on the floor, a thin blanket, a pillow, and nothing else. No chairs, no desks, no toys, nothing that could resemble a normal child's life. The police officers who entered these rooms involuntarily fell silent. Questions about why the children looked so withdrawn and frightened vanished on their own. But the main surprise awaited in one of the rooms, under a mattress, where several children's diaries were accidentally found. These were small notebooks with drawings and short entries. which the children evidently kept secretly from their parents. What the police saw on the pages of these notebooks silenced them completely. The diaries contained no typical children's stories, joyful drawings, or funny phrases. Instead, dark, heavy images. Black figures of adults with enormous hands and faceless eyes. Small figures of children who were crying or hiding in a corner of the room. One drawing depicted a door with bars, behind which stood a child's figure with hands raised upwards as if pleading for help. At the bottom of the page was one short caption: "It hurts here." The drawings were made with a simple pencil, unevenly in haste, as if the author feared being caught and punished. In another notebook, there was an entry made in an uncertain child's handwriting. "Luis will not come back. No one will come back if they go down." What this down meant, the police did not know, but a chill ran down the spine of everyone who read it. With each new page of the diaries, Juan and Elena's version of troubled teenagers and childhood illnesses crumbled before their eyes. No childhood illnesses could explain the bars on the windows and the empty rooms. No amount of Sophia's imagination could create such diaries with drawings that made even adults feel a heavy dread. These diaries and the conditions in which the children lived were the first serious evidence that not only refuted the Sanchez's words, but literally screamed about what was truly happening in that house. It now became clear that Juan and Elena's story was a meticulously planned lie, covering something far more sinister and frightening. At this moment, the police realized that they were no longer dealing with mere suspicions, but with real evidence of a crime. Now there was only one question: how deep did they need to dig to find the truth? And the police decided to dig deeper, in the literal sense of the word. Because it was now clear what Sofia called Luis's disappearance could turn out to be far more terrible than even experienced officers wanted to imagine. One might think that after such a discovery, anyone would panic, deny the obvious, or try to explain something. But the Sanchezes did nothing of the sort. Instead of emotions or any excuses, they chose a completely different path. Juan and Elena simply fell silent. Their behavior became strange, calm and even indifferent, as if it wasn't about serious accusations but some minor misunderstanding. When presented with the diaries and asked why there were bars on the windows of their house, Juan calmly replied with one short sentence: "We will only speak in the presence of a lawyer." No explanations, no attempts to justify themselves or prove their innocence. Just the steady, cold tone of a person who clearly knows what they are doing. This behavior surprised even seasoned police officers. Usually, innocent people behave differently. They protest, demand an investigation, try to explain every detail, prove that it's all a mistake. But not this time. The Sanchezes simply remained silent, coldly and confidently. And it was then that the police decided to investigate them even further. They requested not only testimonies from neighbors and witnesses, but also the financial reports of the Sanchez couple. And here again, a very strange detail emerged that no one expected to see. Among the regular payments made by Juan and Elena, strange recurring transfers to the account of the same person stood out. The recipient of these transfers was their nearest neighbor, a man living just 50 meters from the Sanchez's house. Money was transferred to him regularly, once a month, for almost 2 years. The amounts were not huge, but large enough to raise the question: for what? And this was evidence of a completely different level. Why would an exemplary family regularly pay their neighbor? What did he do for them that required monthly payment? The police went to the neighbor, and he was clearly flustered when he saw people in uniform at his doorstep. At the beginning of the conversation, he was nervous, confused in his answers, saying something about debts and help with chores. But when he was asked directly, did he know anything about what was happening in the Sanchez's house, the neighbor fell silent. "I have nothing to tell you," he quietly replied. but it was already clear from his eyes that he knew much more than he was saying. The officers returned to the station and pieced together the facts. Regular payments, the strange behavior of the Sanchezes, the neighbor's silence. All of this pointed to only one thing. The neighbor had seen or heard something that Juan and Elena wanted to conceal at all costs. It turned out that the ideal family was possibly paying him not for help around the house, but for his silence. And he, it seemed, had been silent for quite a long time. But why did he choose to remain silent? What exactly did he see? Or know? And why was he so clearly frightened now, seeing the police at his home? These questions hung in the air, and it was clear that the answers could turn the entire investigation upside down. Meanwhile, the Sanchezes still acted as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. They simply waited for their lawyer, showing neither anxiety nor panic. Their indifference already seemed chilling, as if they knew something the police didn't yet. It turned out that beneath Juan and Elena's impeccable exterior lay a much more complex and darker story. They weren't just hiding the truth. They were systematically, coldly, unemotionally covering their tracks. The regular payments to the neighbor were just another piece of evidence of how far they could go to maintain the perfect family image. Now the police had a serious argument that could make not only the neighbor, but also the Sanchezes themselves speak. The questions could no longer be ignored. What exactly did he see? What made him keep silent? Why did Juan and Elena calmly observe what was happening, as if they expected every next step the police took? Everything became much more complicated and much scarier than one could have imagined at the very beginning, and the police understood that the next step would be decisive. They needed to make the neighbor talk, because now it was definitely known. He was a witness. Perhaps the only person capable of revealing what exactly was happening behind the closed doors of the Sanchez's house. It was this man, living just 50 meters from the ideal home, who could shatter Juan and Elena's last hope of keeping their secret. Now the police were sure of one thing. The secret the Sanchezes were hiding was so dark that it could be paid for years. And it was this secret they intended to uncover in the coming days. Until this point, it was still possible to assume that the Sanchezes were indeed just overly strict parents. That perhaps their children were really sick, and the neighbor was paid for help with the garden or household chores. Yes, it already looked extremely doubtful, but there was still some loophole for doubt. But on that day, when Sophia was called in for an additional conversation, all those loopholes closed permanently. In the presence of a child psychologist, Sophia began to speak much more openly than before. And it was on this day that words were uttered, after which there was no turning back. Sophia no longer just spoke about Luis's disappearance. Now she said what the police had feared to hear from the very beginning. When the psychologist cautiously asked Sophia if she remembered exactly what happened to Luis, the girl remained silent for a long time. She was choosing her words, afraid to even utter them aloud. But then, quietly, barely audibly, she said, "Luis was punished. Punished very severely. He couldn't take it. He died." The office fell completely silent for 1 second. The psychologist gently continued to ask, to make sure Sophia understood what she was saying, that it wasn't just some guess or fantasy of hers. Sophia didn't look away. She stared straight ahead, as if mentally reliving that day. "He died because he was punished very severely," Sophia repeated. "We all saw him being taken downstairs, and then he was gone." To the psychologist's question about what downstairs meant, Sophia answered almost immediately, briefly and clearly, "To the basement. They always punished people there. No one ever came back from there the same as they were before. But Luis, he just didn't come back." Now the question was direct. "Sophia, do you know where Luis is now?" And she fell silent again, breathing heavily. It was clear how difficult these words were for her, but she said exactly what changed the whole case definitively. He was buried. There, in the garden, behind the house. They told us he left, but we saw. These words, spoken clearly and concretely, with a lucidity that could not be attributed to childish fantasies, sharply changed everything. The case ceased to be just a story of abuse or suspicious behavior. Now it was testimony about a possible murder and concealment of a body. And after such words, believing the Sanchez's version of Sofia's teenage fantasy became impossible. The police immediately reclassified the case. Now it was no longer just a check of accusations of cruelty or strange payments. It was a full-fledged criminal investigation with a specific goal: to find the body hidden in the garden. And if before that the police had acted cautiously, carefully gathering evidence and not rushing to conclusions, now there was no time to delay. Every minute could cost the truth. But even after such horrifying words, Sofia continued to speak. She told the psychologist and the officers what she herself had seen, about how Luis was taken downstairs, how the children heard screams, how after that a deathly silence fell over the house, and no one dared even whisper his name. She repeated again and again, as if afraid that she might not be understood or believed. He died. Luis will never come home again. None of us will come back if we are taken downstairs. And at that moment, the psychologist understood that Sofia was not making things up. That this was not the fantasy of a child trying to get attention. These were the words of a person who had experienced something so terrible that even adults could barely imagine it. It now became clear to the police. They were dealing not just with cruel parents, but with people who were willing to go to any lengths to preserve their public image. People who were willing to lie, pay a neighbor for silence, keep children in fear and absolute isolation, just so no one would know what exactly was happening in their home. Sofia's words completely shattered the myth of the Sanchezes as an exemplary family. Now every fact fit into a single, terrifying picture. The bars on the windows were not to protect the children, but so that they could not escape and tell the truth. The empty rooms without furniture were not a sign of care or illness, but a way of suppression. And the money the neighbor received was payment for his silence about what he accidentally saw or heard. But the main thing now was something else. The police knew the specific place to look for evidence of the crime. In the garden, behind the ideal home that was so often featured in newspapers, perhaps a terrible discovery was hidden, capable of finally putting an end to this story. After this conversation with Sofia, there was no turning back. The girl's words became the crucial piece of evidence that forever changed the scale of the investigation. Now the police no longer just wanted to find out the truth. Now they knew exactly where to look for it. And it was precisely this, the spot in the garden behind the Sanchez's house, that would become the starting point for the next stage of the investigation. The police already understood that they would have to dig literally, not only into the family's past, but also into their own garden. The garden, which for all these years had looked so perfect and well-maintained, could now become the place where the Sanchez family's most terrible secret was hidden. A secret for which they had already paid too dearly for the police to let them escape accountability. When it comes to serious accusations, especially those like Sofia's, the investigation never relies solely on words. No matter how convincing the testimony, it must be physically confirmed using scientific methods. Therefore, when a forensic team arrived at the Sanchez's backyard early on July 20th, 2021, they had one goal: either to refute Sofia's terrible words or to finally confirm them. The Sanchezes still maintained absolute composure. Outwardly, the house had not changed. A well-kept lawn, flowers, perfect pathways. But it was precisely this perfection that now seemed eerie, because every step of the experts seemed to remind them that something terrible was hidden behind the neat facade. First, special equipment was brought to the site. a ground-penetrating radar. This device can literally scan the soil to a depth of several meters, detecting any anomalies. Officers stood aside, watching as the expert slowly moved the device over the perfect lawn. No one said a word. Only the quiet hum of the equipment and the clicks of buttons could be heard. For the first few minutes, it seemed that nothing unusual was present. Even one of the policemen standing nearby thought that perhaps Sophia had gotten something mixed up after all. But after a few minutes, the expert slowed down, carefully looking at the screen, then stopped and raised his hand. There's something here. An anomaly in soil density. The depth is approximately 1.5 meters. After these words, no one doubted that they had to dig. The atmosphere changed sharply. Now it became clear. Either it would now be proven that Sophia was telling the truth, or the whole story would completely collapse, and her words would remain just words. The police carefully marked the spot and began to slowly, very carefully, dig up the area. The deeper they went, the more tense the anticipation became. 1 hour passed. Then a second. The police dug by hand, so as not to accidentally damage anything if what Sophia was talking about was indeed there. No one said it aloud, but everyone already understood what they were looking for. There was absolute silence all around. Even the birds, it seemed, had stopped singing. And then, when the depth reached approximately 1.5 meters, the shovel of one of the policemen hit something hard. Everyone froze, and he slowly, very carefully cleared the dirt around the find. At the bottom of the pit, the first signs of what no one present wanted to see, but everyone expected, became visible. These were human remains, small, clearly belonging to a child. The policeman who cleared the find quietly exhaled and looked back at his colleagues. Now there was no doubt left. Sophia was telling the truth. Beneath the layer of perfectly manicured garden lay the Sanchez family's most terrible secret. Experts carefully documented the discovery, photographed it, and recorded the location of the find. Now every step had to be officially confirmed so that no one would have any doubts about what had happened. Forensics acted clearly, methodically, and calmly. This was no longer just a garden in the backyard of a beautiful house, but a crime scene that could completely change the fates of all its inhabitants. When the remains were carefully lifted and packed for further examination, it became definitively clear. There was no turning back. This was no longer a case of domestic violence or isolation. Now the investigation had become a case of murder and concealment of a body. Sophia's testimony was fully confirmed not by words, but by real physical evidence that could no longer be denied. The experts continued their work, and people began to gather around the house. Neighbors stood silently, trying to comprehend that this was actually happening here, in their quiet and prosperous town. The house, which seemed ideal for all of Pietrablanca, now turned out to be the place where the most terrible truth was hidden behind a beautiful facade. This time, even the Sanchezes, who had until now silently observed what was happening, finally changed their expressions. Juan's cold composure began to disappear. For the first time, he looked bewildered, and Elena, standing next to him for the first time, lowered her gaze, as if she could no longer hide what both of them had known from the very beginning. The remains discovered in the garden became the turning point of the entire case. The police now had irrefutable proof that Sophia's words were true. They had not just children's testimonies or suspicious transfers to a neighbor. Now there was a tangible, physical trace capable of providing answers to the most difficult questions that had plagued the entire city for several weeks. Now, only one step remained: to determine exactly what happened in that house, and who exactly was guilty of it. But the most important thing had already happened. The truth, hidden beneath the Sanchez's perfect lawn, had come to light. There was no turning back, and the investigation had to go all the way, no matter how terrifying and unpleasant it was to face such truth. When such serious evidence as the found remains appears in a case, the police always ask one more question. Who else could have known about it and kept silent? Perhaps it was not just one family's secret, but something more, an entire network of people who preferred not to see the obvious. The first person to come under police scrutiny was the neighbor, the very one who regularly received money transfers. When he was called in for questioning again, it became obvious that he was no longer just nervous. He was openly afraid. There was fear in his eyes, not of the police, but of his own conscience. After a few minutes of conversation, he broke down and confessed that he had actually seen signs of abuse on the Sanchez children a long time ago. "Yes, I saw what was happening there," he said quietly. "I saw bruises on the children's arms, how they sometimes cried in the garden, but I did nothing. Understand, I had debts, and Juan offered to help with money. He just told me not to interfere and not to tell anyone anything. I needed the money." I kept silent, even though I knew I was doing wrong. The neighbor looked depressed, but at the same time, he did not hide anything he knew. He did not participate in what was happening, was not an accomplice, but simply preferred to turn a blind eye while the money flowed into his account. Now he clearly repented, realizing that his silence could cost too much. The police understood that the neighbor was not a criminal, but a witness, and a valuable one. He could confirm that something terrible had been happening in the Sanchez's house, long before Sofia decided to run away and tell the truth. In parallel, another question arose. How could it be that for a long time no one noticed the children's absence from school? This seemed strange, so the police decided to check the school teacher who had inquired several times why the children were not attending classes. Perhaps she also knew more than she was telling. But when her correspondence and records began to be checked, something entirely different was revealed. The teacher was indeed concerned about the children, wrote to the parents, asked why the children were not going to school, but each time received convincing answers from the Sanchez's. The children are sick. The children have individual home. Schooling. We often travel to other cities, so the children do not attend classes regularly. The teacher even tried to contact Child Protective Services, but there she was reassured, being told that the family was absolutely reliable, and there was no reason for concern. Thus it quickly became clear that the teacher was not an accomplice or a confederate, but simply a person whom the Sanchez's had very skillfully misled. She became a victim of this artfully constructed lie, believing, like many others, in the ideal image of this family. Thus, one suspect, the neighbor, turned into a witness, and the second, the teacher, was completely excluded from the circle of suspects. These were false leads that momentarily confused the investigation, but very quickly became clear and simple. In the end, the police returned to where the case began. It was now obvious that the only suspects in the terrible crime remained Juan and Elena Sanchez. No network of accomplices existed. There was only a couple capable of so masterfully hiding a terrible truth. The next step was obvious. To question the Sanchez's again, now having not only the children's words but also real testimony from a witness who saw what was happening with their own eyes. Now the police needed to make the Sanchez's themselves speak, and they finally had all the necessary evidence to do so. When a story like this unfolds, it seems that what happened was some kind of sudden breakdown, a bad day, or a fatal mistake. But the deeper the investigators delved into the Sanchez's lives, the more obvious something else became. What happened to Luis was not an accident. It was only the tip of the iceberg, a terrible culmination of a long, multi-year history. After the remains were discovered, psychologists met with the other children again. They were reluctant to speak for a long time. Silence and fear had firmly entered their lives. But gradually, step by step, details began to emerge that made even the most experienced police officers lose their composure. It turned out that the first manifestations of cruelty began almost immediately after the adoption of the first two children in 2012. The children recalled how at first it seemed like just strict rules, a discipline they had never known before. But gradually it became something much more sinister. Control intensified, punishments became more frequent and harsher. When in 2015 the family took in 2 more, among whom was Sophia, the situation drastically worsened. Now there were 4 children, and the Sanchezes tightened the rules even further. They were forbidden to leave their rooms without permission, to talk to each other without adults, and even food now became a form of punishment. It could be a reward, or it could be withheld for an entire day. The most difficult moment for the children was the spring of 2019, when Luis appeared in the family. He was the youngest and immediately became the main target of Juan and Elena's anger. The other children said that he was punished almost daily. If before the punishments were merely cruel, now they became frightening, so painful that the children feared Luis would not survive. And at some point, it happened. The children recalled that March evening of 2019 with tears in their eyes. They heard Luis being led downstairs, heard screams that abruptly stopped. Since then, no one had seen him again, and the Sanchezes simply said that he had moved to another city. The children were afraid to ask questions, and neighbors and acquaintances suspected nothing, because outwardly, everything looked perfect. Now the investigation clearly saw Luis's death was not an accident or an isolated incident. It was the logical conclusion of years of systematic suppression and cruelty that had become the normal life of these children. The Sanchezes controlled their every step, every word, every movement. Their house became a prison where the slightest disobedience resulted in punishment. The boy's death was just a terrible finale that was bound to happen sooner or later. It was this, the systematic, multi-year nature of the crime, that completely changed the scale of the investigation. Now Juan and Elena Sanchez no longer looked like merely strict parents who had gone too far. Now they looked like people who had consciously built a system based on fear and pain. These testimonies from the children finally removed any doubts. It became clear to the investigation. This was not an isolated crime, but a long chain of actions, each of which aggravated the guilt of the suspects. The Sanchezes could no longer simply explain what happened as an accident or a breakdown. Now the police faced the final task, to make Juan and Elena admit their responsibility for what had been happening in their house for many years. And now no one doubted. Their dark past had not just come to the surface, it had been fully confirmed by those who had experienced it firsthand. Any defense, even the most thought-out and ironclad at some point, cracks. For Juan and Elena Sanchez, that moment came when they first found themselves in separate interrogation rooms. Now they had to not just repeat rehearsed versions. Now they had to withstand a real battle with irrefutable evidence. And the question was one: which of them would break first? The interrogation began calmly, methodically. The investigators took their time, but at the same time acted firmly and consistently. First, they showed the children's diaries found in the house. Elena, looking at the drawings and entries, immediately fell silent. She did not even try to explain them or say it was some kind of mistake. She just remained silent, lowering her gaze. Juan, however, initially remained calm, calling the diaries fantasies of troubled teenagers. But then the investigators presented bank statements showing regular transfers to the neighbor. Here, Juan also began to visibly nervous. His version of friendly assistance to the neighbor collapsed before their eyes. "Do you mean to say that friendly assistance looked exactly like this?" asked the investigator, spreading a detailed report of the transfers on the table. "Every month, a strictly fixed amount, in exchange for silence?" Elena was silent again, not even raising her head. Juan tried to say something, tried to explain these monies as the neighbor's debts, but it was already obvious. He was starting to get lost, getting tangled in his own words. Then followed the testimony of the neighbor himself, the very one who admitted seeing bruises and hearing children cry. Whаt tried to interrupt the investigator, but he was harshly reminded that now his words meant nothing against the witness's testimony. The last, final argument were photographs of what was found in the garden of the Sanchez's house. When the investigator silently placed the pictures of the remains on the table, a complete silence fell in the interrogation room for a second. Eleanor did not even look at the photographs, as if she could no longer deny anything. Her silence at that moment was louder than any words. But What, seeing the photographs, sharply changed his expression. He was clearly not prepared for such direct evidence, did not expect the police to find the body so quickly and so accurately. And it was at this moment that the Sanchez's defense, their unified and carefully constructed line of conduct, finally collapsed. What suddenly sharply turned to the investigator and almost shouted, "It wasn't me. It's all Elena." I tried to stop her, but she wouldn't listen. "You don't understand what she's really like." The investigators were prepared for much, but did not expect What to start shifting the blame directly onto his wife. It now became clear that there was no longer unity in this couple. Each began to defend themselves. Eleanor remained silent, not reacting to her husband's accusations. She looked down, as if she had long ago accepted the inevitability of everything happening. But What continued to speak, getting more and more tangled and contradicting his own words. "It was her who was cruel. She made me keep silent. She said it was the only way to keep the children under control. I was afraid of her." Now it became obvious to the investigators, their tactic worked. The Sanchez's could no longer stick to a common version, could not maintain the lie that had been their shield for so long. Their testimonies began to contradict each other, destroying everything they had so long hidden behind the mask of an ideal family. The interrogation, which began calmly, ended in a complete defeat for the Sanchez's. And now the investigation only had to record their words and figure out which of them bore more responsibility for what had been happening for years in their house. And this meant that the investigation was entering its final, decisive stage. When a case goes to court, what matters most are not just suspicions or testimonies. Facts are needed that cannot be disputed or interpreted otherwise. And precisely such a fact appeared on the investigator's desk on October 15th, 2021. On that day, the police received a document that put an end to the question of whether Luis's death was an accident or a pattern of his entire life in the Sanchez's home. The forensic medical examination report looked dry and official, but it was in this dryness that the full gravity of the situation was hidden. The cause of Luis's death, according to experts, could not be definitively established. The body had been underground for too long, too few traces remained. And at first, this might even have given the Sanchez's hope that the accusation of death would remain unproven. But further in the report, details appeared that left no room for excuses. On the remains, experts found clear signs of injuries, and not one or two. These were multiple old, already healed bone fractures of different ages. Some of them clearly arose several months before death, others a year, 2, and even more. Now before the investigation was not just a report of death, but a detailed and terrible list of injuries Luis received long before he was gone. A list that made absolutely impossible the version of an accident, an accidental fall, or some isolated incident. No, this was documentary evidence of long, systematic abuse that had been happening for many months and even years. This data fully confirmed the testimony of the children, who until then had been the only source of information about what was happening in the house. They spoke of regular punishments, but until the experts' report, these were just words. Now, however, the investigation had a scientific, irrefutable argument that spoke clearer than any witnesses and harsher than any confessions. When the report was read in the presence of lawyers and the Sanchez's themselves, a heavy silence again hung in the interrogation room. Eleanor continued to be silent, But now her gaze was not just lowered, it was completely empty. She seemed to understand that there was no point in trying to deny anything anymore. Too much evidence, too many facts. Too much was already known. Juan listened to the results of the examination with clear concern, periodically looking back at his lawyer as if trying to understand if there was any hope of justification. But the lawyer only silently flipped through the papers, avoiding his client's gaze. It was clear that the defense had nothing to oppose to this dry, scientific document. It was at this moment that the Sanchez's last attempt to present what happened to Luis as a tragic accident or unforeseen circumstances collapsed. The forensic medical examiner's report became the final proof that what happened in their house was not an accident. It was a system built on cruelty and fear, and Luis became its most terrible victim. Now the investigation no longer needed to prove anything. The report spoke for itself. Before the court was an irrefutable picture of many years of systematic infliction of pain. This became the main line of the prosecution, which could no longer be disputed or refuted. The case was coming to its logical conclusion. The police received what they had been waiting for so long. Not just testimonies or confessions, but absolute scientific confirmation. This was the moment when even the most stubborn defenders of the Sanchezes had to admit. There was no longer any question of who was to blame and whether it was a crime. The next step remained only for the court to determine the measure of responsibility and the degree of punishment for the people who had hidden the horror behind the facade of an ideal family for so long. The forensic medical report became the irrefutable evidence that left them no chance to escape responsibility. When all the evidence is on the table, and there is virtually no hope of escaping responsibility, one last tactic remains: to admit what can no longer be denied, and to deny what can still be presented differently. It was this path that Elena Sanchez took after familiarizing herself with the forensic medical expert's report. Through her lawyer, she submitted a partial confession. This was not a full confession of guilt in the true sense of the word. No, everything sounded different, legally thought out and cautious. Elena admitted only one thing. She admitted that she indeed knew about Luis's death and participated in concealing this fact from the police and from everyone around them. But at the same time, Elena categorically denied that Luis's death was intentional or the result of systematic actions. She continued to insist on the version that it was an accident, that the boy allegedly slipped, fell down the steps in the basement, and she and Juan simply got scared of the consequences, so they decided to conceal what happened. Thus, Elena admitted the most obvious, what could not be disputed: the concealment of the body, the burial in the garden, the silence before the children and neighbors. But at the same time, she still tried to maintain the illusion that there was no intention to cause harm, let alone kill. She seemed to hope that this would allow her to avoid the most severe punishment. Juan, unlike his wife, continued to maintain his previous line, complete denial of his involvement. Even after all the presented evidence, diaries, bank statements, experts' report, he insisted that he was not guilty either in the boy's death or in its concealment. He completely shifted the blame onto Elena, claiming that he only learned about Luis's death after the fact, and remained silent because he feared the consequences for the entire family. These two contradictory confessions, one of which was partial and the other a complete denial, clearly demonstrated that the Sanchezes had finally lost their unity. Now each of them thought only of themselves, trying to minimize their responsibility and shift most of the blame onto the other. The investigation, however, no longer needed a full confession to completely expose the couple. Elena admitted to a key fact that became legally undeniable: the concealment of death. And considering the forensic expert's report, her version of an accident looked frankly unconvincing. The prosecutors understood perfectly well that a full confession would have been an ideal conclusion for the case. But even Elena's admission of concealment already fully confirmed the police's and investigation's worst suspicions. This was the last piece of the puzzle that allowed them to finally destroy the image of the perfect Sanchez family. Now only one step remained, the trial, which was to decide who among them was more guilty and what their final punishment would be. Elena's partial confession, though it did not completely close the question of guilt for the death, put an end to the question of whether the Sanchez family was capable of a crime. No one could doubt anymore that they were capable, and capable of much. The investigation completed its work, the exposure was complete. And now the Sanchez case passed into the hands of the court, which was to dot all the I's definitively. There was very little time left until the trial, but for the final point to be made, the investigation needed to take one more important step: to reconstruct the chronology of events of that very March day in 2019, when Luis disappeared forever. And now the scattered facts, the children's testimonies, diaries, and even Elena's cautious admissions formed one clear picture. So what happened at the Sanchez house that day? According to the case materials, that day Luis was punished especially severely for some transgression. None of the children could remember exactly what it was anymore, and it wasn't important. He was locked in the basement room of the house, which the children simply called downstairs. There, according to them, the most terrible punishments took place. Several hours after Luis was locked up, Elena went to check on him and found that the boy showed no signs of life. The Sanchezes realized that something irreversible had happened, and it was then that they jointly decided to conceal what had happened, not to call an ambulance, not to inform the police, but simply to bury the body in the garden so that no one would ever know anything. The burial was carried out late at night. The other children were forced to remain silent, instilled with fear and assured that it would be better for everyone. And until Sophia's escape, all of this was indeed securely hidden from all outsiders. Now before the court was not just a story, but a clear reconstruction of all events, from the last punishment that led to the tragedy, to the cold and calculated decision to bury the body. It was this chronology that the judge was to study, and it was to become the basis for the final decision that no one would be able to dispute. February 10th, 2022, the day when the story of the Sanchez family received its official conclusion. The courtroom was overflowing. There were residents of Pietrablanca, journalists, neighbors who could not believe that all this time they had lived next to such a nightmare. All previously collected evidence was presented in court. The neighbors' testimony, video recordings of the children's interrogations, diaries, expert reports, everything that investigators had painstakingly collected for many months. The defense tried to present what happened as death by negligence, but it was already obvious that the verdict would be much harsher. The hall fell silent, awaiting the judge's decision. And finally, the words sounded clear and distinct. Juan and Elena Sanchez are found guilty of cruelty leading to death and concealment of a crime. The court sentences each of them to 30 years of imprisonment. There were no emotions on the faces of the spouses, only emptiness and resignation. The verdict put an end to a case that forever destroyed the illusion of a perfect family in the small town. But even after this verdict, one important question remained in the Sanchez story, a question that never received an answer. After the court put a final end to the Sanchez case, life in Pietrablanca was never the same. The surviving children were placed under state care. Now they had to learn to live without fear again, step by step, returning to normal life. The house on the outskirts of the city, once a symbol of an ideal family, was sold to new owners. But now it stood empty and dark, as if reminding the entire city how easily a terrible secret could hide behind a beautiful facade. The Sanchez story caused a huge public outcry. People could not believe for a long time that all this was happening next to them. Since then, everyone in Pietrablanca began to look around a little more carefully.